What's going on, everyone? Chris back again with episode 53 of What Could Have Been in Wrestling. This week, we're going back to the year 2000, and we're talking about everyone's favorite booker, Vince Russo. Now, this topic was suggested to me by one of my subscribers, and thank you very much to Jimmy the Lumberjack. His original topic is, what if Vince Russo didn't stop running a video store and become the lead booker for the Attitude Era, but then eventually go to WCW and book there and contribute greatly to their demise? That's a pretty big topic, so I really just want to focus right now for this video on one particular time, and that would be the spring of 2000, where Russo was brought back a second time, and really talk about what if WCW had actually smartened up and not brought him back after that debacle the first time. So let's get right into it. So let's just go back to the fall of 1999, because that's when Vince Russo had his first go around in WCW, and he wasn't on camera, but he had that whole angle where I think the Harris twins were his enforcers, and the whole thing was he was in the backstage making matches, and he was the leader of the powers that be, and I think Curt Hennig was a part of that as well. Anyways, after a lot of stupid angles, and of course, booking that Bret Hart vs. Goldberg match, and doing a lot of other stupid stuff like bringing in Ed Ferrara to be Oklahoma, and having matches like Judy Bagwell on a pole, they eventually sent him home because they realized this guy was full of shit. But of course, and by the way, just as a side note, Eric Bischoff had been sent home in September of that year of 1999. So going into the year 2000, they didn't really have much direction. And they were still desperate, even though it turned out they were about a year away from being bought out as a company. They were still trying to make a last-ditch effort to get back in the game and overtake WWE. So now let's enter the year of 2000, and now let's fast forward to April of 2000, and this is where they had brought back Vince Russo. Vince Russo is in the ring with the group that became known as the New Blood. It was with guys like Jeff Jarrett, Scott Steiner, Booker T, etc., and also guys like Billy Kidman. And then he talked about how the young guys weren't just in the game during his first go-around. They were changing the game, bro! And then the good old boys network basically cut the cord on what he wanted to do. He comes in and just talks about how the young guys never got a fair shake, and that they're going to get their opportunities now, and everything is going to be earned. And then I think you had DDP, Sting, and Luger watching from the back monitor, so they're not involved, so it's the older guys being shunned, because it's time for the younger guys, even though, like I said, that I just named, to shine. And with that in mind, enter Eric Bischoff, who comes out and cuts off Russo, and he gets a good reaction. He actually gets cheered, because it looks like he's going to be there in defense of his boys, like I said, like the Nashes, the Hogans, Sting and Luger, etc. And it looks like there's going to be tension between the two. But it's a swerve, bro! And Bischoff and Russo, they hug! Yes, fuck! They hugged. So, Eric Bischoff gets on the mic and talks about how his biggest regret is bringing in Hulk Hogan, and that was his biggest mistake. And now he's going to give those guys who've been held down for all those years their shot. And of course, we get the whole angle of the heels, the guys who've been held down, who just want to get a shot, who want to get their fair shot and opportunity because of their love of the business and wrestling. And they don't want to just cash a check like the Millionaires Club is doing. Somehow they're positioned as the heels, even though you should probably want to root for them after all the years that they've been repressed. feuding with the babyface Millionaires Club. So I think we all know how this ends, obviously, because Vince Russo eventually got sent home along with Ferrara. And WCW, by the time he was done with it, that second go around was not salvageable. And in no coincidence, they had lost so much money that previous year that basically they lost their TV time and were put up for sale. And then, of course, we get that infamous moment of Vince McMahon opening Nitro. So what if they don't bring back WCW, or bring back Vince Russo to WCW, I should say? And what if, because like I said, Eric Bischoff had been sent home, but of course he made his return that night. What if they only bring back Bischoff because he was actually responsible for some success during the 90s for WCW Nitro, etc. And they rely on him instead to bring back WCW to prominence, and Vince Russo is out of the picture. Here's how I think things could change. Now, that spring, they were going into Spring Stampede, and I know that Jeff Jarrett did become the World Heavyweight Champion, defeated Diamond Dallas Page, because he was looked at as the crown jewel for the New Blood. Well, that's the first thing that would change, because Jeff Jarrett, even though he was being elevated to being a world champion, I've never looked at Jeff Jarrett in that light, and I think he was much more suited as a mid-card talent. And yes, I know when he started his own promotion, he made himself champion, but let's be real. His contributions, while he has notable contributions to wrestling, his time as world champion came because he was very good friends with Vince Russo at that time. So with that in mind, while the angle itself would change, obviously Vince Russo wouldn't be there to open Nitro. I think instead you could get a returning Eric Bischoff coming out to open Nitro and announcing that he's back, and that obviously things are basically going to go back, and he still has the back of to where they were, and he still has the back of his guys like Hogan, Nash, Luger, and Sting. And I think it would have been more appropriate and made more sense to have the Millionaires in the heel role, still trying to hold down the New Blood. So with that in mind, you could have the babyface New Blood now warring with the heel Millionaire Club. And instead of it being a hostile takeover, so it's not exactly a recreation of the NWO, you can have it be the New Blood Uprising. So it's more of a mutiny by the younger guys who do want their shot. And of course, that could include guys like Booker T, Rey Mysterio, Chavo Guerrero, etc. And of course, they wouldn't have anyone representing them, like I said, on an authority side, because Bischoff coming back as an authority figure would have the back of the Millionaires. But I think there could be one veteran that sides with the Millionaires and agrees that they deserve their chance and they should get their shot to be stars, and that guy could be Ric Flair. Ric Flair obviously had his issues with Bischoff dating back to the NWO. So now, going forward, you have Ric Flair as the mouthpiece of the Millionaires Club, with the main centerpieces being Booker T, also probably even a guy like a Rey Mysterio, and also even endorsing a guy like Kidman, even though I don't think Kidman should be beating Hulk Hogan, who would be back to being a heel at this point, siding of course with the Millionaires. And then of course, the crown jewel of the New Blood team, if you still want to call them the New Blood, would be, or obviously you can call maybe the New Guard, versus that old guard that I already mentioned, would be Bill Goldberg. So the main feuds you can have definitely going into that Spring Stampede, if you still want to have, you don't have to have the titles held up like they did when guys like Jarrett handed over his U.S. title and Sid had to give up his World Heavyweight title, and I think the Harris boys gave up the tag titles. I don't think you need to reset and have new champions crowned, but you can have it where Sid is still the champion, and you can have it where actually his allegiance is unknown, but instead now he's in a triple threat match with Kevin Nash and, of course, Bill Goldberg going into that Spring Stampede as the main event. And you can still keep Jeff Jarrett, like I said, since he's better slotted in the mid-card, as the U.S. champion. And I think that's a good spot for Booker T. So now going forward, I know that it's still a lot of the same main eventers, but Bill Goldberg was still, I still think, a hot draw for WCW even in 2000. And going into Spring Stampede, I think you can have it where Booker T wins the U.S. title from Jeff Jarrett to get the new blood some gold. But finally, I think you can see it where Sid would actually make his decision known, and he should actually retain his World Heavyweight title, but he would actually do it by pinning Kevin Nash. And in regards to that, while he doesn't formally join the New Blood, he's definitely not signing with the Millionaires. So you can have Sid kind of in that lone wolf type gimmick where he's actually more of an outsider, no pun intended, and he still doesn't have his allegiance. So now as we move forward now to Slamboree and we go into the late spring and then we're getting closer to the summer, you can still have these two factions warring. And of course, one thing that did happen the night Vince Russo came about and re-debuted was he did mention that Shane Douglas had left the company, but that was a swerve, of course, because he reappeared later that night to attack Ric Flair. And I think you can still have that where you can have Bischoff and Flair having their war of words leading into Spring Stampede, and then you can have it where Rick can still wrestle. And in this instance, you can still have it where Shane Douglas attacks Ric Flair, and that's going to give Flair something to do as the, I guess you could call him the leader of the Millionaires Club, to feud with Shane Douglas, which I purposely want to do because I want to take him out of the world title picture, because Russo always had the title changing literally week to week, and it made the belt meaningless because 7 to 10 day reigns literally devalued that belt. And that's another reason I want Sid to retain, because I want you to have a consistent champion, so when he loses, it means something. So now finally, going, like I said, into Slamboree, you can have it where Goldberg has a shot at Sid for the World Heavyweight title. But then, this time, he had retained it last month by beating Kevin Nash. You can have interference on both sides, but eventually, due to interference from the Millionaires Club, Sid is actually able to defeat Bill Goldberg and retain his world title, but officially solidify himself as a heel because he accepts the Millionaires' help and shake hands with Eric Bischoff. And now we have the heel world champion Sid, but we have established contenders, and of course Bill Goldberg, but also Booker T. So now as we go into that summer, another thing that would change going into Great American Bash is we actually wouldn't have Bill Goldberg turning heel, which got no reaction, and you wouldn't have him embracing Russo and Bischoff. You would keep him as a babyface, which is where he was better suited. And while he'd want another shot at the belt, the Millionaires can bring in their enforcer to deal with Goldberg and tell him that, hey, you lost last night, and have him obviously get confronted on Nitro and saying there's no room for you in the world title picture because you're a two-time loser. And you can have, that's right, Scott Steiner backing up the Millionaires Club and basically taking Goldberg out of that world title picture, because Obviously, I don't want Goldberg versus Sid happening again for the third pay-per-view in a row. So that could kickstart the Goldberg and Steiner feud. So now going into, like I said, Great American Bash. That's where I think you can actually have Booker T, if we go back to him, lose the U.S. title. And you can actually have him lose it. I wouldn't want him to lose it back to Jeff Jarrett even at this point. I think it would actually be more interesting if he lost it, if he lost the belt to someone maybe like a Lex Luger to give him a title reign, but also so we don't we're not just swapping the belts back to their original title holders. And I think Lex Luger as a heel US champion could have actually had a pretty good run. So now we're still left without a number one contender for the World Heavyweight title. And this is where I think actually it would be a one-off challenger. I don't think you would actually have anyone who could actually credibly be presented yet as a World Heavyweight title contender. So you could take someone from that like I said, from the New Blood team and still try to get the world title back on their side over to their camp and take it from Sid. And you could even go with someone like, I wouldn't want it to be Booker T yet for obvious reasons, but you could go with someone like a Mysterio, like I was saying, or you can obviously go with one of the younger guys they bring in, like a Chuck Colombo, or a Stasiak. But I think actually, in this case, you can actually give, if you want to give these new guys a chance, give Chuck Colombo a chance to show what he can do in a main event role. Yes, it would be in a losing effort, and he wouldn't be successful, but I think it would be a good way to shake up WCW and show that they are really trying to make new stars. And I do know that I believe I read that Eric Bischoff, had he gotten the buyout that he was looking for in 2001 to run WCW on his own with his group of investors with Fusion Media, I believe he actually had plans to make Chuck Colombo the world champion. So at the Great American Bash, we have Booker T losing the US title. We have obviously Steiner versus Goldberg. And of course we have Chuck Colombo versus Sid. And it's a New Blood night where Sid is able to retain the title again. So this brings us to Bash at the Beach. And this is a big thing that would change. Because if you remember at Bash at the Beach, that's where Jeff Jarrett laid down for Hogan midway through the show. Hogan, quote, wins the World Heavyweight title. But then Vince Russo comes out and cuts that work shoot on Hogan, talking about how Hogan wanted to play his creative control card, and how Vince Russo had to deal with all the bullshit of the politics, trying to go back and forth with Hogan, and said that that belt wasn't the real world title belt, that was the Hulk Hogan Memorial belt, and that there's going to be another world title match between Jeff Jarrett and a man who truly deserves it, Booker T, which led to Booker T winning the world title that night. So now, if we're going down to Bash at the Beach, we still have Sid as the champion, and now with Goldberg out of the picture, and Booker T losing his US title, Ric Flair can basically back Booker T and nominate him to be the guy to dethrone Sid. He can still obviously have his issues with Shane Douglas and take on Douglas at Bash at the Beach himself and probably come up on the winning end of that. And then finally, after coaxing, Sid agrees to put his belt on the line against Booker T in the main event of that Bash at the Beach. Representing the Millionaires Club would be Sid versus the uprising team of the New Blood, with that being the babyface Booker T. And after probably not a terribly long match, because we know how limited Sid was, you can have Booker T still getting his crowning moment and still winning the World Heavyweight title. And bringing it home to the New Blood and showing that the young guys are finally getting a chance to lead the company. This, I think, would actually be much more well received rather than Vince Russo's way of putting the belt on Booker T. And it was unnecessary trying to do a work shoot and do this whole swerve with Hogan. And then Hogan actually never came back to WCW after that night, so there was no follow-up to it anyways. It also provides a longer run for a heel world champion. So like I said, so the title change for Booker T means more because you're not passing around the world title belt every 2 weeks. And of course, it would obviously establish Booker T as the guy who dethroned Sid, and hopefully it would elevate him to being a main event player in the people's eyes after years of holding the tag belts and the television title. So that's where I'll leave it. If you want a part 2 to extend on how I would book WCW going through the year 2000, let me know. Let me know what you think of my idea of having the New Blood guys be the baby faces in this scenario if Vince Russo wasn't around. And also let me know what you think of my idea, obviously with the Millionaires Club being close to an NWO rehash, but of course being led by Bischoff, it would still be the older guys trying to keep the younger guys down. And obviously, if you would still have Booker T become the World Heavyweight Champion, or if you would try to find a way to maybe get it back on Goldberg instead. So leave your comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And thanks everyone for all your support. And I'll be back again soon. Take care, guys.